Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we're venturing deep into places that feel forgotten by the world, where roads end and silence stretches for miles. Before we begin, a word of warning. These stories are not for the faint of heart. They are real, or as real as anyone can recount them. And they happened in the kind of places where help is hours away, if help ever comes at all. You might be comfortable in your chair or lying in bed, but the middle of nowhere has a way of reaching through the calm. And tonight, it will reach you too. Take a deep breath, settle in, and let the darkness take the first step. The first story begins in the dense woods of northern Montana. My friend Alex and I, both young and reckless at the time, decided to spend a weekend camping in a part of the forest we had been warned about. Locals said no one went there alone, that the trails twisted back on themselves, and that sometimes, after a storm, travelers vanished without a trace. We laughed it off, of course. Adventure called louder than fear. Armed with nothing more than tents, a couple of old rifles, and a pair of backpacks stuffed with supplies, we set out, ignoring the creeping sense that we were being watched from the very moment we left the main road. The trail narrowed quickly, overgrown with thick brush, mud sucking at our boots with every step. Birds were silent, as though the forest itself had swallowed sound. About 3 hours in, we stumbled upon a small clearing where someone or something had clearly passed recently. Broken branches, a small fire pit with blackened stones, and scraps of fabric that looked suspiciously like clothing. We shrugged it off at first, imagining hunters or hikers, but there was a staleness to the air, a weight that made each breath feel borrowed. My stomach churned, and Alex, usually fearless, kept glancing over his shoulder, muttering under his breath about the wrong vibes. We decided to set up camp near a creek a little deeper into the woods, thinking proximity to water would help us stay safe. As night fell, the forest darkened unnaturally fast, almost as if shadows themselves had weight. The usual night sounds of insects and frogs were gone, leaving only the echo of our own movements. Around 10 o'clock, a sound snapped us both to attention. Something or someone was moving close by. Not rustling leaves, not an animal scurrying. It was deliberate, measured, slow steps circling our tents. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the dark, but saw nothing. Minutes passed. Then came the voice, low, indistinct at first, almost a whisper. "Hello?" it said, but warped, like someone trying to mimic a tone they didn't fully understand. My hand shook as I shined the light toward the trees. There, just past the edge of the clearing, two eyes reflected the faint glow. They weren't animal eyes, too human, too calculating. Alex and I exchanged glances. "We should leave," he whispered. But moving in the dark, with no clear path and no idea what might be following us, was terrifying. Still, we packed as quickly as we could, adrenaline surging, and began retracing our steps along the muddy trail. We hadn't gone far when we stumbled across an abandoned campsite, even more bizarre than the first. Tents were torn, supplies scattered, and the remains of a fire smoldered faintly. Among the ashes were items that made our blood run cold. A shoe, partially burned, a scrap of clothing that looked unmistakably human. The air had a chemical stench, acrid and sickly, like burned synthetic fabric. Something had been here very recently, and it hadn't left willingly. Alex grabbed my arm, and we both froze as a rustling came from behind a tree. A figure darted across the clearing, pale, thin, impossibly fast, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Neither of us breathed until we reached the next patch of familiar trail. Hours passed, and the sense of being watched didn't abate. Every branch snap sounded like footsteps. Every shadow moved just slightly out of place. We debated trying to call for help, but there was no signal, of course. Just like the locals had warned, in these woods, you were alone. Completely, utterly alone. Exhaustion finally drove us to stop near an old logging road. Here, we thought, maybe there would be a trace of civilization, someone else, anything. But the road was deserted, littered with broken signs and the remains of what looked like abandoned vehicles from decades ago. We slept lightly, taking turns keeping watch. Each creak of the trees setting our hearts racing. Morning came, gray and still, and we decided to hike out. The forest seemed indifferent now, almost mocking, as if it had allowed us a glimpse of its secrets but refused to release us easily. A mile down the path, Alex stopped suddenly, staring at the ground. I followed his gaze to see a series of footprints, human, wet, and oddly large. They didn't match our own. They led into thick underbrush and then stopped, as if whoever or whatever had left them had simply vanished. Goosebumps ran along my arms. That was the first time I realized it wasn't just shadows following us. Something had been tracking our movements. We quickened our pace, eventually emerging onto a wider logging path where the sun started cutting through the canopy. Relief washed over us, but it was temporary. A pickup truck appeared in the distance, old and rusted, crawling along the trail. Inside, two figures stared at us. Thin, wild-eyed, almost feral. They didn't acknowledge us with a wave or a nod, just stared, a predator's gaze, until the trees swallowed them again. The remainder of the hike was tense, every sound a potential threat, every movement a signal of pursuit. When we finally reached the main road, we didn't slow down until we hit the first gas station. Even then, the sense of being watched lingered. That weekend, we learned that the middle of nowhere is not just a place. It is a state of mind, a vulnerability, an open invitation for things you cannot see or understand. The woods keep secrets, and sometimes they allow you to escape, but not without reminding you that you were never truly safe. Alex and I swore never to return. Yet even years later, in the quiet moments before sleep, I replay the faces, the shadows, the eyes reflecting faint light, and remember the fear that had nothing to do with monsters and everything to do with the unknown and human unpredictability. That was the first story, a chilling reminder that isolation magnifies danger, and even ordinary people can become part of terrifying events in the middle of nowhere. As you settle deeper into your seat or your bed, keep in mind what follows tonight is not imagination. These are not tales conjured for entertainment. Each one comes from someone who has lived it, someone who has stared at the dark and wondered if it would stare back. The next story takes us south, into the backcountry of Kentucky, in a small town nestled in the hills where the roads curve endlessly and cell signal is a distant memory. It begins with a young woman, alone, seeking escape from a troubled home. The details are mundane at first: summer jobs, friends, late-night drives. But the setting is crucial. Miles from anyone who could intervene, no neighbors to hear her screams. This is where ordinary decisions meet extraordinary danger. By evening, she was exploring the outskirts of town with friends, unaware that the woods near their route were a favored spot for a man whose motives were unclear and whose presence would change their perception of safety forever. She noticed small signs first: misplaced items, shadows in the periphery, and subtle distortions in the ordinary. A neighbor mentioned odd occurrences. The group shrugged it off, assuming youthful exaggeration. They had no idea how quickly the ordinary would spiral into the terrifying. The night grew darker, the stars hidden behind a heavy cloud layer, and the woods seemed to close in. It started with noises, footsteps too heavy, repeated, deliberate. Then came glimpses, fleeting shapes, figures standing too still. Fear crept in, slow and methodical, as the realization dawned that they were being watched. The sense of normalcy shattered, replaced by an instinctual drive to survive. The shadows that once seemed benign, the trees that once offered comfort, became ominous witnesses to events unfolding too fast to comprehend. The young woman's pulse raced as she felt the eyes on her, not distant or indifferent, but close, calculated, almost predatory. The crunch of leaves underfoot was louder than it should have been, echoing through the otherwise silent forest. Her friends tried to reassure her, laughing nervously, but she could feel their unease as well. The moment they had stepped off the beaten path, the sense of safety had evaporated. Even the trees seemed to lean closer, casting long, twisted shadows that reached toward them like fingers. It began subtly, a rustle in the underbrush here, a snap of a twig there. Then, the unmistakable sound of movement behind them, soft at first, almost imperceptible, until it became deliberate, a rhythm that did not match their own steps, but followed them exactly, keeping pace. They turned, scanning the darkness, and for a brief moment, thought they saw a figure slip between the trees. Heart pounding, the young woman whispered, "Did anyone else see that?" Her friends shook their heads, trying to convince themselves it was imagination. But the forest had a way of teaching lessons harshly. As they hiked deeper, the trees grew denser, the path narrower, and the evening fog thickened, swallowing the light of their flashlights. Every shadow seemed to move independently, and the feeling of being observed became a physical weight pressing on their shoulders. Then they heard it, a voice, low and warped, barely above a whisper, echoing from somewhere in the trees. "Leave now." The words were distorted, like a recording played backward, yet unmistakably human. Panic surged. They broke into a run, boots slipping in the mud, arms brushing against branches that seemed to reach for them. The voice followed, not shouting, not chasing, but keeping pace. The young woman glanced back once, and in that brief moment, saw a man crouched low, watching from behind a tree. His face was hidden in shadow, eyes glinting with intent. She didn't wait to process it. They ran until they burst from the tree line onto an abandoned logging road, breaths ragged, hearts hammering. For a few fleeting moments, relief washed over them. They were out of the woods, at least physically. But the danger was far from over. At the edge of the road, they spotted an old van parked awkwardly under a broken streetlight. The doors were open, but empty. The van had been there when they entered. They were sure of it. And now it sat silently, as if waiting. A chill ran through her spine. They hurried past, not daring to look back. But the feeling of being followed never faded. By the time they reached the nearest house, far off the main road, they were shaking, drenched in sweat, and aware that some part of the forest had chosen to accompany them home. The next story takes us into the Appalachian Mountains, where the remoteness is almost mythic, and a lone graduate student discovered that solitude has its own dangers. He had come to the mountains to scout apartments before beginning his program, expecting quiet streets and peaceful woods. What he found instead was a man who seemed to exist outside normal rules, a landlord whose house held secrets in its shadows. The first impression was unremarkable. A rustic, slightly run-down house, located at the end of a winding road. But subtle details unsettled him. The man's demeanor was calm, almost meticulous. Yet it carried an undercurrent of something he could not name. Questions went unanswered or deflected. The graduate student and his companion were led around the house, shown the main rooms, and then, almost casually, directed to the basement. A shed at the back of the property contained a staircase descending into darkness. No light, no explanation. Just silence, punctuated by the man's deliberate movements. Standing at the top, they felt the temperature drop, a subtle but undeniable change in the air. The basement itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Inside, the faint outline of stairs vanished into pitch-black darkness. The man descended a few steps, pausing to linger in the shadows. It was a test, or perhaps a warning. They could not tell which. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but fear was paired with curiosity, the same mix that lures people into the unknown again and again. Returning upstairs, they explored the rest of the house, finding it meticulously clean, oddly sterile, yet filled with tiny contradictions. Shoes absent, textbooks stacked but untouched, a fridge that looked used but contained nothing edible. The house was a facade of domesticity hiding something fundamentally wrong. The graduate student was aware of the signs. Too many small cues lining up to indicate danger. The attic door, for instance, emitted a sour, meaty odor, the kind that signals decay. Attempts to investigate were met with warnings and distractions. The man's attention seemed to shift as soon as questions arose, focusing solely on the student, ignoring his companion. The air grew heavier with each passing minute, and an unspoken tension filled the space. Something about the house, about the man, suggested a boundary being tested, one that if crossed could have severe consequences. Eventually, intuition overrode curiosity. They left, making excuses and retreating to their vehicle. Yet, the sense of being observed persisted. Every glance toward the house revealed shadows moving unnaturally, as if aware of their every motion. This story, unlike the first, reminds us that danger is not always outside. It can be nestled within walls that seem safe, and it can manifest in a single, quiet person whose presence feels almost inhuman in its control. Safety is never guaranteed. Not in the mountains, not in the woods, and sometimes not even in a home. From Kentucky to Montana, from dense forests to isolated mountains, these stories share a common thread. The ordinary becomes extraordinary when placed in the wrong context. People are unprepared for the subtle escalation of events, and the middle of nowhere has a way of amplifying the smallest signs into life-threatening experiences. Fear builds not just from what is seen, but from what is suggested, what is hidden just beyond perception, waiting for you to let your guard down. Our third story leads us to the Olympic National Park in Washington state. A family seeking respite in the wilderness encountered an unsettling campsite far off the main trail. At first, everything seemed normal. Clearings, small streams, and quiet beauty. But scattered debris, charred scraps of clothing, and an atmosphere of unnatural stillness quickly replaced comfort with unease. Birds did not sing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Every step toward the site brought a realization that this was a place someone or something had left under extraordinary circumstances. They followed the trail of debris cautiously, discovering flattened patches in the moss where tents had once stood and a fire pit still warm, suggesting recent activity. The smell of burned fabric mixed with chemical undertones, heightening the sense that this was no ordinary camping site. The family felt observed, though no one was in sight. Every instinct warned them that lingering would be dangerous. Yet, they could not shake the compulsion to investigate, to understand what had happened. The clearing itself seemed alive, charged with the echo of unseen movements and the remnants of past events that refused to be forgotten. The family stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of the forest pressing in around them. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet their curiosity pushed them forward. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, littered with charred fragments of what once might have been clothing or gear. A thick, acrid scent hung in the air, unmistakably the remnants of something burned recently. Yet the smoke was faint and almost surreal. It was as if the place itself had been preserved in a moment of terror. As they stepped closer, the forest seemed to respond. A branch snapped somewhere to their left, sharp and sudden. Though there was no wind, birds, which moments ago had remained eerily silent, began to stir in distant treetops, though none dared approach the clearing. The family's unease grew with every step, a tangible tension that pressed on their lungs and quickened their hearts. Then they saw it, a scorched mass in the center of the fire pit. At first, they couldn't identify it, only that it was organic, burned beyond recognition. The smell alone suggested something far beyond a simple campfire mishap. They quickly stepped back, instincts screaming. But the forest seemed to close around them. The air grew heavier, more oppressive, and a sense of being watched became overwhelming. No one spoke. Every sound they made was exaggerated, every movement amplified by fear. The trail back to their tents suddenly felt longer, the distance to safety stretching with each step. The realization dawned. Something had been here recently. Something that had left its presence imprinted on the earth itself. They didn't know what had occurred, but they knew enough to flee. By the time they returned to their site, daylight had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The creek they had used as a landmark seemed further away than memory suggested, and the woods around them had become a labyrinth of trees, and shadows. The family packed hastily, adrenaline replacing exhaustion, and began their trek back to the main road. Every rustle, every whisper of movement sent them spinning, flashlights sweeping frantically across the darkened trail. It was a reminder that isolation magnifies fear, that even a familiar path becomes treacherous when the ordinary transforms into something unknowable. Not long after, a forest ranger approached, alerted by a call from another party. The family recounted their experience, describing the strange campsite, the burned items, and the pervasive sense of unease. The ranger's expression shifted from polite concern to something heavier, an acknowledgement that they had encountered a site with a history, a place that had drawn attention before, under equally mysterious circumstances. No follow-up stories were published. No news reports documented the event. Yet the ranger's tense demeanor suggested that the forest held secrets far older and more complex than they could imagine. From there, our next story takes us to the isolated Appalachian Mountains, where a young man's adventure quickly turned into a nightmare. He had embarked on a solo bike trip through rugged trails, seeking the thrill of endurance and the beauty of untouched wilderness. He carried only essential supplies: a small tent, dehydrated meals, and basic safety equipment, confident that his preparation would suffice. However, the mountains had other plans. The path he took led him deeper into unfamiliar terrain, a network of trails forgotten by most maps, overgrown and slick with mud from recent rains. The initial hours were uneventful, scenic even. Mist rolled over the slopes, damp earth filling the air with the scent of pine and soil. The man felt a sense of accomplishment as he navigated narrow switchbacks and challenging climbs. Yet, as daylight waned, he began to notice subtle anomalies: footprints that didn't belong to him, broken branches in patterns that suggested tracking, and faint impressions of someone or something having passed through recently. He dismissed these signs at first, attributing them to wildlife or other hikers. But as night approached, a creeping sense of being followed could not be ignored. Setting up camp beneath a massive tree, he took extra precautions with food storage, aware of the possibility of bears or other predators. Still, the air was heavy with tension, unnatural silence settling over the clearing. The rustle of leaves, distant animal sounds, everything seemed muted or displaced. Sleep proved elusive. At midnight, he awoke to a faint voice, distorted and eerie, calling from the darkness beyond his tent. It was human in tone, but warped, mimicking words in a way that sent chills down his spine. The fear was instantaneous, primal, the kind that roots you in place while your mind races for solutions. The young man grabbed his flashlight, sweeping it across the underbrush, but saw nothing concrete. Only the shadows of trees stretched long by the moonlight. Yet the sense of presence remained, palpable and menacing. As he attempted to exit the tent, a pair of reflective eyes glimmered faintly in the distance. Whatever it was, it stayed just out of reach, pacing him with silent intent. Panic overtook rational thought. He packed in haste, leaving most of his gear behind, and began pedaling through the treacherous terrain, mud and roots challenging his every move. The forest seemed to conspire against him. Switchbacks became perilous. Fog thickened unpredictably, and the unseen follower maintained its proximity. Branches snapped and leaves rustled in a rhythm too precise to be accidental. His legs burned, lungs screamed. Yet he could not stop. Only the distant lights of a roadside village offered relief, and he pushed until he reached civilization, drenched and shaking. Even there, the sense of dread lingered, the impression of being watched persisting long after he had escaped the immediate danger. The following day, he sought out local knowledge, speaking with a man who had spent decades in the mountains. The elder's words confirmed his worst fears. Certain areas of the forest are known to harbor entities that mimic voices, sometimes luring travelers into peril. They do not always follow predictable patterns, and encounters often leave survivors shaken for life. The young man returned home, forever altered, acutely aware that preparation can only go so far when facing the unknown. Our fifth story brings us to a remote campsite in the wilderness, where a group of friends believed their escape would be a simple, relaxing experience. 5 men, early 20s, set up near a stream, confident in their isolation and skills. They were experienced campers, familiar with backcountry safety. Yet, the middle of nowhere has a way of humbling even the most seasoned outdoorsmen. Their evening began quietly, the sun casting long shadows until an old van appeared on the dirt access road. Out of place and unnerving, 2 men emerged, wild-eyed and disheveled, moving strangely, their presence inexplicable. At first, the friends assumed they were lost hikers, but the behavior quickly escalated into something else. The strangers loitered, exhibiting erratic gestures, muttering incoherently. Soon, the friends realized that the wilderness had been infiltrated, that their solitude was violated by a force entirely human, yet utterly unpredictable. The tension escalated, and every sound became a potential threat. The forest itself seemed to echo their fear, magnifying the intensity of each moment. The men froze as they watched the strangers move toward the old outhouse near the edge of their camp. The sounds coming from inside were strange, guttural, a mix of growls and incoherent shouting that didn't match any human voice they had ever heard. Each thump against the wooden walls made the entire structure tremble, and a sense of imminent danger gripped the friends. They considered confronting the men, but quickly realized that any engagement could escalate into violence. Fear and adrenaline coiled tightly within them as they debated their next move. The forest around the campsite seemed to pulse with unease. Shadows shifted as if alive, and the ordinary noises of wildlife vanished, leaving an oppressive silence. Every instinct told them that staying put was dangerous, yet the uncertainty of what awaited them beyond the trees made leaving equally risky. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The men emerged, carrying nothing, faces blank, yet twitching in unnatural ways. Before retreating to the van and disappearing down the dirt road, the friends remained frozen, realizing that the brief encounter had been more than an annoyance. It was a deliberate intrusion into their isolated world. That night, sleep was impossible. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves jolted them awake. Shadows appeared to move independently, and the faint light of the moon seemed to twist the familiar shapes of trees into menacing forms. The forest, normally a haven, had become a labyrinth of uncertainty. Their safety felt fragile, almost illusory, and the boundary between ordinary danger and something far darker blurred. They stayed alert until the first light of dawn, eyes scanning constantly, hearts racing, aware that their experience had fundamentally altered their perception of the wilderness. Meanwhile, in a different part of the country, a young woman faced terror in a seemingly mundane setting. A rental house, rural and quiet, appeared to be an ordinary opportunity, a place to live while attending school. But from the moment she arrived, the house and its owner projected an unsettling energy. Subtle cues suggested control and observation. Questions focused solely on her presence, an unnatural attention to her movements, and a house that seemed staged, sterile, almost unnatural. Every detail, from the locked attic to the strange smells, suggested danger lurking within the walls. Her instincts, sharp and persistent, guided her actions. She noticed the inconsistencies immediately. The fake occupancy signs, the absence of personal belongings, and the vague but oppressive aura the landlord exuded. The basement door, a shed outside the main structure, led to a dark, unlit stairwell. The landlord descended slowly, lingering in shadows, ignoring her companion entirely. The environment was designed to disorient, and she felt it acutely. Her sense of danger intensified as she pieced together what could be inferred. This was not merely eccentric behavior, but a situation with potential for harm. The young woman and her companion left, but the impression of the house and its owner remained. Fear had seeped into their awareness, reminding them that danger can be hidden behind ordinary facades. And the middle of nowhere isn't always a forest or a mountain. It can be a seemingly innocuous dwelling with secrets lurking in the shadows. That day became a lesson. Preparation and awareness are critical. Yet intuition is often the most reliable guide when confronting situations where rules and appearances no longer apply. Back in the wilderness, another story unfolds. One that begins with the illusion of solitude. A lone hiker, inexperienced and unprepared, wandered into the backcountry, seeking adventure without understanding the risks. The campsite he encountered had already been compromised by nature and circumstance. A shredded tent, a man wounded, lying in blood. The scenario seemed surreal, almost cinematic, yet the consequences were tangible. Panic, urgency, and the imperative to act collided. The hiker responded with what limited training he had, providing first aid while coordinating help. This incident underscores the delicate balance between human preparedness and the unpredictable forces of the middle of nowhere. Even basic knowledge and instinctual response can be overwhelmed by the sheer complexity and randomness of outdoor dangers. A black bear had been drawn to improperly stored food, its weight and power nearly fatal to the hapless camper. Quick thinking, improvisation, and sheer luck were necessary to prevent further tragedy. The hiker's experience serves as a stark reminder. Wilderness is unforgiving, and a single mistake can escalate into life-threatening situations. From the quiet woods of Kentucky to the dense jungles of Colombia. The pattern emerges. Isolation magnifies both ordinary and extraordinary threats. Each story demonstrates how the middle of nowhere is not defined solely by geographic remoteness, but by the combination of environment, human vulnerability, and unforeseen variables. From natural hazards to human threats, the line between safety and danger is tenuous, and perception plays a critical role in survival. The tension arises not merely from what is visible, but from what remains hidden, what could emerge at any moment, changing everything. The Appalachian endurance cyclist's story adds another dimension to this theme. His journey through Los Nevados National Park was meticulously planned, yet the unforeseen occurrence of strange noises, eyes in the darkness, and an unidentifiable presence created terror beyond expectation. Preparedness, while essential, cannot fully mitigate fear or the unpredictability of the wilderness. Encounters with entities that mimic voices or follow unseen patterns create a psychological landscape as dangerous as the terrain itself. The human mind, operating under stress and uncertainty, amplifies danger, turning small anomalies into monumental threats. Similarly, urban isolation can harbor terror as effectively as remote wilderness. The young woman's encounter with the seemingly innocuous landlord illustrates that danger is not limited to forests or mountains. Control, observation, and subtle manipulation in environments that appear safe can generate fear and compromise personal security. Awareness, skepticism, and a readiness to act are critical even when no immediate physical threat is evident. The psychological dimension, anticipation, unease, and the knowledge of something being off can be as potent as the physical dangers present in remote wilderness stories. By combining human unpredictability with environmental uncertainty, these narratives highlight universal truths about fear, preparation, and perception. The middle of nowhere is both literal and metaphorical, representing places where human control is limited and variables are multiplied. From natural predators to strangers with unknown intent, and from subtle cues of danger to overtly terrifying encounters, the spectrum of threats is vast. Each story serves as a reminder. Vigilance, awareness, and respect for the unknown are essential, and even the most routine journey can shift into something life-altering in moments. The final story brings the focus back to human unpredictability in isolation. A small group of campers, confident in their skills, suddenly faced an intruder in the backcountry. The man moved silently, observing them from shadows, each of his gestures deliberate and unnerving. Every step they took, every noise they made, seemed magnified in the stillness of the forest. Adrenaline surged, hearts pounded, and the once peaceful environment became an arena of survival instinct. They escaped, but the memory lingered, a haunting reminder that danger often hides behind the ordinary, that the middle of nowhere is defined not just by distance, but by the unpredictability of circumstances. It is a place where human error, chance encounters, and nature's indifference converge. As you drift to sleep tonight, remember, the world beyond the familiar is full of unknowns. Stay aware, respect your surroundings, and never underestimate the power of isolation to reveal what we most fear, unseen and unpredictable.